Rome likes to pretend that its greatest men are born great, that power flows through noble blood, that history is written by families whose names echo through marble halls. But here's a truth Rome never wanted you to hear. The man who reshaped its army, shattered its traditions, and pushed the Republic toward civil war was born with nothing. No noble name, no famous ancestors, no seat waiting for him in the Senate, just dirt under his fingernails. 157 BC. While Rome celebrates its victories and congratulates itself on being eternal, a boy is born far from the capital, in a quiet town called Arpanemum. No trumpets sound, no omens are recorded, no one notices. And that's exactly the point. Because this boy, Gaius Marius, is invisible to Rome, in the Roman world, birth decides your destiny before you ever take your first breath. If you're born into an old aristocratic family, doors open automatically. If you're not, those same doors are sealed shut forever. Marius is what Romans coldly call a novus homo, a new man, a polite way of saying, you don't belong here. His family owns no legendary past, no generals, no consuls, no heroes carved into stone, and in Rome, that's a crime worse than failure. As a child, Marius doesn't grow up listening to political debates or rehearsing speeches meant for the Senate. He grows up close to the land, where survival depends on discipline, endurance, and silence. And while noble boys are taught how to speak, Marius learns how to endure. That difference will change history. Rome's ruling class believes the Republic is strong because of tradition. Marius learns early that tradition is often just fear dressed as law. He watches from the outside as the same families rotate power between themselves, generation after generation, the same mistakes repeated, the same arrogance rewarded. And slowly, something dangerous forms in his mind, a realization. Rome isn't ruled by the best men, it's ruled by the best-born men. And that makes Rome fragile. But a boy from Arpanemum has no right to think like this, no right to dream beyond his station, no right to challenge the order of the world. So he doesn't speak, he waits. Because men like Marius learn something early. If you don't have a voice, you sharpen your patience. The only path upward, the only one Rome allows to men without pedigree, is war. So when Marius is old enough, he leaves everything he knows behind and joins the Roman army, not as a hero, not as a commander, but as another nameless soldier expected to obey and die quietly. And this is where Rome makes its first mistake. Because while others see the army as a duty, Marius sees it as a classroom. He watches how fear spreads faster than fire, how bad leadership kills more men than enemy swords, how discipline, real discipline, can turn chaos into victory. He notices things aristocratic commanders never do because they've never known hunger, humiliation, or being disposable. While privileged officers rely on status, Marius relies on competence, and soldiers notice. They notice who marches with them instead of above them, who eats the same rations, who understands exhaustion. Slowly, loyalty forms, not to Rome but to the man who understands them. This is dangerous. Rome's system depends on soldiers being loyal to the state, not individuals. Marius doesn't set out to break that rule, but by existing, he already is. As he rises through the ranks, resistance follows him everywhere, promotions questioned, achievements minimized, success explained away as luck. The message never changes. Know your place, but Marius refuses, not loudly, not rebelliously. He refuses quietly, by being better, and this is where the tension begins to build. Because Rome can forgive failure, it can forgive weakness, but it cannot forgive an outsider who succeeds. By the time Marius reaches manhood, he has become something Rome doesn't know how to handle, a man without noble blood who commands respect. And respect in the Roman Republic is power. Yet the Senate still believes it can control him, that his origins will keep him grateful, that he'll know when to stop. They are wrong, because men who rise from nothing don't fear falling. They've already been there, and soon Rome will face a war that exposes everything it's been hiding: corruption, incompetence, decay, a war in North Africa, a war against a king who understands Rome's weaknesses better than Rome understands itself. A war that will drag one forgotten soldier into the center of history. And when that happens, Rome will learn a painful lesson. The most dangerous men are not born in palaces, they're forged in neglect. Rome didn't just divide people by wealth, it divided them by worth. In the Roman Republic, your value as a human being was decided long before you ever spoke your first word. It was written in your family name, your ancestry, your bloodline, and if that bloodline wasn't old enough, powerful enough, or respected enough, then no matter how capable you were, Rome had already judged you. This is the world Gaius Marius is trying to climb, and it is designed to crush men like him. Rome's elite call themselves the nobles, families who trace their power back generations, who decorate their homes with death masks of ancestors who once held office. These masks aren't just art. They are warnings. They say, we have always ruled, and we always will. For them, leadership isn't earned. It's inherited. The Senate is filled with these men, educated, polished, confident, and dangerously out of touch. They believe Rome's greatness comes from tradition, from doing things exactly as they've always been done. To challenge, that is to challenge Rome itself. And Marius is an insult to that worldview. He has no ancestral masks, no legendary grandfather, no political network protecting him. Every step he takes upward feels, to the elites, like theft. This class divide isn't subtle, it's brutal. Aristocratic sons are groomed for power from childhood. They're taught how to speak persuasively, how to manipulate crowds, how to command respect without earning it. Failure is forgiven. Mediocrity is tolerated because their birth protects them. Men like Marius don't get that luxury. One mistake could end everything. One misstep could send him back into obscurity. And yet, despite this suffocating system, Rome needs men like him, even if it refuses to admit it, because the Republic is quietly rotting. Wealth is concentrated in fewer hands. Small farmers are being crushed by debt. Soldiers return from war to find their land gone, bought up by elites who never fought themselves. The army, once made of citizen farmers loyal to the state, is weakening, but the Senate refuses to change. They don't want reform, they want stability, even if it's fake. And this is where Marius becomes dangerous, because he doesn't believe Rome is strong. He believes Rome is pretending. Everywhere he looks, he sees cracks. Generals chosen for their names, not their ability. Armies led by men who've never marched beside their soldiers. Policies shaped by pride instead of reality. To the ruling class, these aren't problems, they're traditions. To Marius, they're warning signs. But here's the cruel irony. Rome's system allows outsiders to fight and die for the Republic, but not to lead it. Marius can bleed for Rome, he can kill for Rome, but he's not supposed to command Rome. And yet, on campaign after campaign, soldiers listen to him more than their aristocratic officers. They trust him, they follow him, not because he demands loyalty, but because he understands them. This terrifies the elite, because power in Rome flows downward, not upward. The idea that a man without noble blood could inspire loyalty threatens the entire social order. If soldiers start believing leadership comes from competence instead of birth, the Republic's hierarchy collapses. So the Senate tightens its grip. They mock Marius behind closed doors. They downplay his achievements. They treat him like a useful tool, not a future leader. But Marius isn't naive. He understands that Rome doesn't hate him because he's weak. Rome hates him because he proves the system is wrong. And systems hate mirrors. As he navigates this world, Marius learns something critical. If he plays by Rome's rules, he will always lose. The game is rigged. Advancement is allowed only up to a certain point, and then the ceiling slams shut. So he begins to think differently. Not about how to fit in, but about how to change the game. This is where ambition takes root. Not selfish ambition, but transformational ambition. The kind that doesn't just seek power, but seeks to reshape the structure that controls it. And yet, Rome still believes it has time. It believes Marius will eventually accept his limits, that he'll grow grateful for what he's given, and stop pushing. They don't see what's coming, because history shows us something terrifying. When a rigid system refuses to adapt, it doesn't survive, it shatters. And men like Gaius Marius, they don't shatter quietly. They shatter empires. But before that happens, Rome will march into a war it thinks it understands, against an enemy who exposes everything Rome has ignored. And Marius will finally be given a stage, not because Rome trusts him, but because Rome is desperate. War does not begin with glory. It begins with fear. The kind that tightens your chest before the first clash. The kind that makes even the strongest men question whether they'll see another sunrise. For Gaius Marius, war was not a stage for honor. It was a brutal teacher, one that punished arrogance and rewarded endurance. From his earliest campaigns, Marius learned something Rome's aristocrats never did. Battle doesn't care who you are. The enemy doesn't ask about your ancestry. Hunger doesn't respect noble blood. Cold nights on campaign treat senators' sons and peasants the same. But the difference was this: aristocrats expected comfort. Marius never did. While young noble officers complained about mud, rations and long marches, Marius absorbed everything. He watched how exhaustion broke formations, how panic spread when leadership hesitated, how soldiers fought harder for commanders who stood beside them instead of above them. He learned that discipline wasn't about punishment, it was about trust, and trust in the Roman army was rare. Commanders were often appointed through politics, not experience. Many had never earned the respect of the men they led. Orders were given from horseback, far from the dust and blood, where decisions mattered. Marius marched on foot. He carried his own gear. He ate the same food. He slept under the same open sky. And soldiers noticed. They noticed who didn't disappear when things went wrong, who didn't panic when the line wavered, who understood that morale could win battles faster than numbers. War hardened him, but it also clarified him. Every campaign stripped away illusions. The illusion that Rome was invincible, the illusion that its leaders were competent, the illusion that tradition alone could hold an empire together. Marius saw men die because of poor planning, saw legions collapse due to arrogance, saw commanders refuse to adapt because doing so would admit weakness, and he remembered, because survival favors observers. Unlike many around him, Marius didn't seek quick glory. He sought understanding. He studied enemy tactics. He paid attention to logistics, supply lines, terrain, weather, things aristocrats dismissed as details. To Marius, details were everything. He understood that soldiers didn't break because they were cowards. They broke because they were hungry, exhausted, or led poorly. And that realization quietly reshaped his view of Rome itself. The Republic celebrated courage, but it neglected preparation. It praised tradition, but punished innovation. Marius began to see the Roman army not as a perfect machine, but as a fragile structure held together by habit, a structure that worked only because enemies had not yet fully tested it. That would not last forever. War also taught him something darker. He learned that loyalty, once earned, could be redirected. Soldiers didn't swear loyalty to abstract ideas. They swore loyalty to the men who kept them alive. This truth unsettled Rome's elite and fascinated Marius, because if loyalty could shift, so could power. But at this stage, Marius was still careful. He wasn't trying to overthrow anything, he was trying to survive and to become better. Each battle added another scar, each march added another lesson, each loss sharpened his resolve. He saw young men arrive full of pride, only to be broken by reality. He saw veterans carry invisible wounds that Rome would never acknowledge. War was not the clean, heroic thing politicians described. It was grinding, unforgiving, relentless, and Marius endured it all. Not because he loved war, but because war revealed truth. And the truth was this: Rome's strength didn't come from the Senate. It came from ordinary men who were treated as expendable, men like him. By the time Marius began to stand out, it wasn't because he spoke loudly, it was because results followed him. Units under his influence held longer, fled less, recovered faster. This made some superiors uncomfortable, because competence without pedigree threatens hierarchy. Whispers followed him. Jealousy grew, suspicion formed, but Rome couldn't deny what worked, not yet, and then came a conflict that would expose everything Marius had learned. A war marked by corruption, delay and humiliation, a war against a cunning enemy who understood Roman arrogance perfectly, a war that would drag Marius out of obscurity and place him directly against the Republic's decay, the war in Numidia, and there, the lessons of blood and survival would finally collide with politics. If Rome ever needed proof that its republic was rotting from the inside, it was about to find it, not in the Senate, not in the streets, but on a distant battlefield in North Africa. This war would expose everything: greed, corruption, incompetence, and the terrifying truth that Rome's greatest enemy wasn't foreign, it was itself. The war against Jugurtha, king of Numidia, didn't begin as a grand struggle. At first, Rome treated it like a minor problem, an inconvenience on the edge of its growing empire. Another client king stepping out of line, another quick victory to remind the world who was in charge. But Jugurtha was not a typical enemy. He had grown up in Rome, he understood Roman politics, he understood Roman greed, and most importantly, he understood how easily Rome could be bought. Jugurtha didn't fight Rome head-on at first. He bribed it. Senators, generals, officials, men sworn to defend the Republic, sold its honor for gold without hesitation. Entire campaigns were delayed, battles were avoided, peace treaties were signed and quietly ignored. Rome looked powerful from a distance. Up close it was compromised. For soldiers on the ground, the situation was infuriating. They marched through hostile land, suffered ambushes, and watched their leaders hesitate, not out of caution, but out of corruption. And among those soldiers was Gaius Marius. By now, Marius had seen enough war to recognize when something was deeply wrong. Orders didn't make sense. Opportunities were wasted. Jugurtha escaped again and again, not because he was unbeatable, but because someone always ensured he slipped away. The war dragged on, men died. Nothing changed, and that silence from Rome. It wasn't ignorance, it was complicity. This war wasn't just being mismanaged, it was being exploited, and Marius saw it clearly. Serving under the aristocratic commander Metellus, Marius proved himself repeatedly. He fought hard, he led effectively, he earned the loyalty of soldiers who were tired of dying for other men's greed. But while Metellus was competent, he was still bound by the same system, a system that valued appearances over outcomes. Marius began to realize something dangerous. Rome didn't need a better general, it needed a different kind of leader, someone not tied to old loyalties, someone not afraid to offend the Senate, someone who understood the cost of corruption because he'd paid it in blood. And for the first time, Marius did something bold. He spoke, not loudly, not recklessly, but clearly. He criticized the war's leadership. He called out inefficiency. He spoke directly to soldiers and civilians alike, exposing what Rome's elite wanted hidden. That was unheard of. a novus homo, challenging the noble class, not on philosophy, but on competence. The Senate was outraged. Metellus was insulted. Rome's elite felt threatened, but the people listened, because while nobles debated honor, common Romans were tired of failure. They were tired of sending sons to die in a war that never seemed to end. Marius became a symbol, not intentionally, but inevitably, a man who spoke plainly, a man who had risen without favors, a man who looked like Rome's future instead of its past. And then he did the unthinkable. He ran for consul. In Roman politics, this was audacity bordering on madness. The consulship was the highest office in the Republic, reserved almost exclusively for men of ancient lineage. Marius had none, but he had something far more dangerous: popular support, against tradition, against expectation, against the wishes of the Senate. Gaius Marius was elected consul. Rome had crossed a line it didn't even realize existed. And now the war in Numidia was his responsibility. Where others had stalled, Marius acted. He didn't rely on bribery or half measures. He reorganized. He enforced discipline. He moved aggressively. Jugurtha, used to exploiting Roman hesitation, suddenly faced a commander who wouldn't be bought. The war shifted. Jugurtha was hunted relentlessly. His allies were pressured. His escape routes closed. And eventually betrayed by his own kin, Jugurtha was captured. Rome celebrated, but the celebration masked something far more significant. This war had not just ended a conflict, it had exposed the Republic's weakness and revealed a man capable of exploiting that weakness for reform or for domination. Marius returned to Rome, not just as a victor, but as a warning. He had shown that the old system failed. He had shown that popularity could overpower tradition. He had shown that the army could follow a man, not just the state, and Rome's elite were terrified because they understood something now. Gaius Marius wasn't just a general, he was a precedent, and precedents change everything. Rome believed its army was sacred, not sacred in a spiritual sense, but untouchable. A system handed down from ancestors, protected by tradition, and guarded fiercely by the elite. To change it was heresy, to question it was treason, to rewrite it was unthinkable, and yet this is exactly what Gaius Marius was about to do. Because when Marius returned from Numidia, he didn't come back blinded by victory, he came back disturbed, haunted by what he had seen. Rome had won the war, but only after exposing how close it had come to humiliating failure. The Republic congratulated itself, the Senate praised tradition, and then it prepared to do nothing differently. That terrified Marius, because he knew the truth. Rome had survived not because its system worked, but because its enemies hadn't yet pushed hard enough. And that was about to change. To the north, beyond the Alps, massive tribal confederations were on the move. The Cimbri and Teutones, entire peoples migrating, not raiding, men, women, children, tens of thousands strong, and they were crushing Roman armies. Legions vanished, commanders panicked, defeats stacked up one after another. Rome had not faced a threat like this in generations. Suddenly, tradition wasn't comforting anymore, it was deadly, and Marius saw it clearly. The problem wasn't courage, it wasn't numbers, it wasn't even the enemy. The problem was how Rome fought. For centuries, the Roman army had been built on one assumption, that soldiers were landowning citizens, men with property to defend, men who could afford their own armor, men who fought temporarily, then returned home. That system no longer worked. Rome had expanded too far. Wars lasted too long. Small farmers were ruined. The pool of eligible soldiers was shrinking. And the Senate's response? Ignore it. Because acknowledging the problem meant admitting failure, Marius refused to pretend, so he did something that shook the foundations of the Republic. He opened the army to the landless poor. Men with no property, no stake in the traditional Republic, no place in the old hierarchy. To the Senate, This was madness. These men were seen as unreliable, dangerous, disloyal. They believed only property owners could be trusted to defend the state responsibly. But Marius understood something the elites didn't. A man with nothing fights differently. He fights harder, he fights longer, and he bonds deeply with whoever gives him purpose. Marius promised these men something radical, not just pay, not just loot, but a future, weapons provided by the state, training provided by the army, and land after service. For the first time, Rome's army stopped being a temporary obligation and became a profession. This was revolutionary and terrifying, because now soldiers depended on their commander, not on the Senate, for their livelihood. The old system cracked, but Marius wasn't done. He standardized equipment, no more mismatched armor based on wealth. Every soldier now looked the same, trained the same, fought the same. Discipline replaced class. He restructured legions for flexibility, improved logistics, reduced unnecessary baggage, increased mobility, and he trained relentlessly, marching, drilling, repeating, until his soldiers became known mockingly and then fearfully as Marius's mules, men who could march farther, fight longer, endure more. The Senate scoffed. They called it excessive, un-Roman, undignified. But the battlefield told a different story, because Marius's army worked, and success silences critics, at least temporarily. Yet beneath the surface, something irreversible had happened. Rome's army no longer belonged to Rome. It belonged to its generals, and Marius knew this. He didn't say it aloud, he didn't frame it as ambition, but he understood power when he saw it. Soldiers now swore loyalty, not just to the Republic, but to the man who fed them, trained them, and promised them land. This was a turning point, not just in Roman history, but in the idea of the Republic itself. Because once soldiers fight for individuals instead of institutions, politics becomes violent. Marius had broken sacred rules, rules that had kept Rome balanced, imperfect, but stable. And now there was no going back. The irony is brutal. Marius didn't intend to destroy the Republic. He intended to save it. But history is cruel. Sometimes the changes made to prevent collapse are the very ones that cause it. And Rome, desperate and afraid, didn't punish Marius for these reforms. It rewarded him, again and again and again. Because now, Rome needed him more than ever. The northern threat was approaching, and only one man had an army capable of stopping it. The same man who had just rewritten the rules of Roman warfare. The same man who had unknowingly laid the groundwork for future dictators. The same man Rome could no longer control. Next, those reforms will be tested not in theory, but in annihilation-level war. Rome did not realize it at the time, but the moment Gaius Marius finished reforming the army, the Republic crossed a line it would never be able to uncross. What emerged was not just a stronger fighting force, it was a new kind of power. Before Marius, Rome's army was temporary, a seasonal obligation. Farmers left their fields, fought Rome's wars, and returned home. Their loyalty belonged to the Republic because their lives were rooted in it. After Marius, that balance vanished. The army became a career. Men enlisted not for tradition, but for survival. They stayed for years, not months. They depended on the army for food, pay, protection, and eventually land, and most importantly, they depended on their general. This changed everything. Marius understood something few politicians ever did. Loyalty is not created by speeches, it is created by stability. When a man's future is tied to his commander, loyalty becomes personal. And personal loyalty is dangerous. The new soldiers drilled endlessly, marching became ritual, endurance became identity. These men were no longer farmers who happened to fight. They were fighters who happened to be Roman. Uniform weapons erased class differences. A poor man stood beside a wealthier one, as equals, shields aligned. Armor matched. The legion moved like a single organism. Rome had never seen anything like it. The Senate watched nervously. They told themselves this was temporary, that once the crisis passed, things would return to normal. But systems rarely revert once power shifts, and power had shifted. The army now followed competence, not pedigree. Orders were obeyed, not because of law but because of trust, and that trust flowed upward toward the man who shaped their lives. Marius became more than a commander. He became a provider, a protector, a symbol. Soldiers spoke his name with reverence. They joked that they carried the Republic on their backs, and they weren't wrong. Rome's safety now rested on men who had once been invisible to it, and then came the test. The Cimbri and Teutones were no longer distant rumors. They were moving south. Entire Roman armies had already been annihilated. Panic gripped the Republic. For the first time in centuries, Rome feared extinction. The Senate had no choice. They turned to Marius again, and again, and again. 5 consecutive consulships, an unprecedented violation of republican norms. Rome was trading principles for survival, and Marius accepted because he knew something the Senate didn't want to admit. This wasn't just a war, it was a reckoning. As the legions prepared, something strange happened. Soldiers no longer fought for Rome's abstract glory. They fought for their unit, their commander, their brothers in arms. They trained harder than ever. Discipline became identity. Marches grew longer. Standards became sacred. The Roman army transformed from a collection of citizens into a professional war machine. And when battle finally came, the difference was terrifying. At Arque Sextiae, Marius didn't just defeat the Teutones, he destroyed them. Using patience, positioning, and psychological pressure, he crushed an enemy that had wiped out Roman armies before. Bodies covered the fields. Survivors were enslaved. The threat was neutralized. Then came Vercellae. The Cimbri faced Marius's legions under the open sun. His soldiers held formation. They didn't panic. They didn't break. They executed. By the end of the day, the Cimbri were no longer a people. Rome was saved, and Marius was hailed as its savior. But beneath the celebrations, something irreversible had happened. The army that saved Rome no longer belonged to the Republic. It belonged to the system Marius created, and to the men who led it. Future generals would remember this. They would remember that soldiers follow loyalty, not law. That power flows from legions, not votes. That reform can become domination. Marius didn't set out to create emperors, but he made them possible. And Rome, blinded by relief and victory, applauded the man who had unknowingly rewritten its fate. The Republic survived, but it was no longer the same Republic, and the consequences of this transformation were just beginning. Victory is intoxicating. It tastes like blood, sweat, and triumph. It makes soldiers cheer and citizens celebrate. But in Rome, victory comes with a price, especially if you are a novus homo, a man whose family tree has no senators, no consuls, no illustrious ancestors. Gaius Marius had saved Rome twice, thrice. He had reformed the army, defeated foreign enemies, and restored faith in the Republic's fading military power. Yet for all his achievements, he returned home to something he could not conquer, the Senate. The Senate's admiration was fake, their congratulations hollow. Behind every polite nod and public praise lurked suspicion, envy, and resentment. The men of noble birth could not tolerate the truth. A man from the dirt, from Arpinum, from nothing, had surpassed them. A man they had dismissed as unworthy now commanded respect, loyalty, and power they could never claim on their own. The hatred simmered quietly at first. Whispered comments in marble corridors, silent glances at public forums. Every minor decision of Marius was scrutinized, twisted, and politicized. He was not just a threat to tradition, he was a threat to the Senate's very ego. And Rome had a way of punishing threats, slowly, strategically, without acknowledging them openly. Marius realized quickly that saving Rome didn't mean being safe, it meant being feared, even by those he served. Politics in Rome was a battlefield almost as dangerous as any foreign war. Bribes, alliances, betrayal, honor could be weaponized. A single misstep could destroy a man's reputation, career, and life. And Marius had already broken 2 unwritten laws. He had taken command of the army without noble blood. He had redefined the army's loyalty from the Republic to its general. Both were unforgivable. The first sign of trouble came after his victories over the Teutones and Cimbri. Rome celebrated publicly, but behind closed doors the senators plotted. Some accused him of overstepping his consulship. Others feared he might use the army to gain permanent political power. And some, the proudest of all, were simply humiliated that their names could no longer shine brighter than his. Marius had learned long ago how to survive in the field. He now had to learn how to survive in the forum. He adapted quickly. He spoke to the people directly, bypassing the Senate whenever he could. He leveraged his victories into popularity. He reminded Rome that armies alone could not save the Republic. Only a competent general could. The Senate despised it. The people loved it. This duality defined Marius's political life. Every law he proposed, every reform he suggested, was framed as necessity. He appealed to the common citizen, the soldier, the marginalized veteran, men who now had a reason to see the Senate as irrelevant and Marius as indispensable. And yet Marius was careful. He didn't openly defy the Senate, not yet. He knew that one miscalculation could make him an enemy of both the state and the people, and the very soldiers who followed him could be redirected if not managed wisely. The tension reached its peak during his campaigns to secure land for veterans. Marius argued tirelessly that Rome's soldiers, especially the landless recruits he had trained and fed, deserved compensation. The Senate balked. They claimed tradition, they claimed budget constraints, they claimed law. But Marius saw it differently. This wasn't generosity, this was survival. If veterans went unpaid, disillusioned or neglected, the army's loyalty would crumble. And with it, Rome itself would be vulnerable to both internal revolt and external invasion. This understanding put him at odds with the elite in a way no battlefield victory could. Rome's senators were used to being untouchable. To them loyalty was owed, not earned. To them authority was inherited, not demonstrated. Marius turned all of that upside down, and the hatred became personal. Stories began circulating, exaggerated, distorted, malicious. Marius was accused of corruption, ambition, and worse. Senators suggested he sought kingship. They whispered that he could turn Rome into a dictatorship. For the first time, a man who had saved Rome became Rome's enemy. Marius ignored them publicly. Privately, he knew he could not. Every measure of power, from popular support to military control, had to be carefully maintained. A misstep could allow one of the envious senators to destroy him politically, even if the army remained loyal. And they tried. The political games were brutal. Laws blocked his veteran settlements, speeches ridiculed his reforms. Elite families pressured allies and attempted to delegitimize his command. Every action of Marius was analyzed for weakness, every word twisted into accusation. Yet Marius had survived worse. The battlefield had taught him endurance, patience, and cunning. He applied the same strategies to politics as he had to war: anticipate the enemy, outmaneuver them, and exploit every advantage. He used public rallies, he leveraged speeches. He capitalized on his reputation among the people. He reminded the Senate quietly, repeatedly, that without him, their republic was fragile, vulnerable, and mortal. And that was terrifying to Rome's elite. For the first time in centuries, a Roman general was more than a tool. He was a political force in his own right. A man who could sway votes, public opinion, and even the army without aristocratic pedigree. Marius's hatred from the Senate would never fully dissipate. It simmered through his later life, culminating in political battles that would eventually lead Rome towards civil unrest. But for now, he had learned an essential lesson. In Rome, victory on the battlefield is never enough. Survival depends on understanding power beyond the sword. Every reform, every law, every decision from this point forward had to navigate not just enemies in foreign lands, but enemies within marble halls. And Marius, the boy from Arpinum, the man no one thought would matter, was learning how to become untouchable. Because Rome might reward him publicly, but it could never accept him privately. And that tension between heroism and hatred, between military success and political danger, would define the rest of his life. Rome had survived external threats. It had endured invasions, rebellions, and disasters on the battlefield. But sometimes, the most dangerous wars are fought not with swords, but with ambition, jealousy, and betrayal within the city itself. Gaius Marius had already broken tradition, transformed the army, and become indispensable to Rome's survival. Yet no one ever warned him. Success attracts enemies closer than any foreign army ever could. Enter Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a patrician, polished and cunning, a man born into power, with ancestral glory written into his very name. To the Senate, he was the natural choice for leadership. To Marius, he was the first man to threaten everything he had built. And so began a rivalry that would shake the foundations of the Republic, a rivalry that would define Rome for decades. The tension began during the Juguthine War. Sulla, a young officer of noble lineage, had ambitions of his own. He saw Marius, a novus homo, winning glory that should have been Sulla's by bloodline. Every victory, Marius claimed, felt like a personal slight to Sulla. And in Rome, ambition is often masked as honor. The first spark of real conflict emerged in politics. Marius, backed by popular support and the loyalty of soldiers, had managed to gain multiple consulships, unprecedented for a man without aristocratic pedigree. Sulla, however, was a product of tradition. He believed leadership belonged to men like him, men whose names carried weight, whose ancestors had shaped the Republic, and Marius threatened that order. The rivalry wasn't subtle, it was psychological, political, dangerous, and it had all the ingredients of a civil war. Rome needed soldiers to face new external threats, particularly the Germanic tribes. The command of these armies became a point of contention. Marius's reforms had given him unprecedented control over the loyalty of legions, and he wielded this as a tool, consciously or unconsciously, to assert political dominance. Sulla, on the other hand, had the Senate's favor and a burning desire to reclaim what he believed was his rightful honor. Conflict was inevitable. When the social war erupted, a rebellion by Rome's Italian allies demanding citizenship, the stakes escalated. The command of the campaign against these allies was critical. It wasn't just about winning battles, it was about demonstrating political superiority. Whoever controlled the army could control Rome. Initially, Sulla was given command. He had the official backing of the Senate. He had the pedigree, the connections, and the authority. But Marius had something Sulla didn't: the support of the people, and more importantly, the army. Through manipulation, persuasion, and sheer audacity, Marius managed to have command stripped from Sulla and transferred to himself. The Senate was outraged, patricians were humiliated, and Sulla was left seething. This act of political boldness set a dangerous precedent. Loyalty could be redirected, rules could be bent, and tradition could be broken, all in the name of necessity or ambition. Sulla's response was both calculated and ruthless. He swore vengeance. He left Rome under the guise of obedience. But every action he took from that point on was driven by one goal: to reclaim authority and punish Marius. Civil strife had now moved from whispers to tangible danger. Rome's streets, once a place of debate and politics, became battlegrounds of intrigue, fear, and loyalty tests. Senators were forced to choose sides. Soldiers whispered in barracks. Alliances shifted overnight. Marius, however, was no stranger to survival against impossible odds. He understood that wars of influence were different from wars of combat, yet the principles were similar: anticipate, adapt, dominate. He used popular support strategically, leveraging public opinion to reinforce his political authority. Every speech, every public appearance, every proposal was calculated to solidify loyalty and undermine Sulla's legitimacy. But Sulla was equally strategic. He waited, he observed, and when the right moment arrived, he acted decisively, setting the stage for the first march on Rome. Yes, for the first time in history, a Roman general would bring his army into the city itself, defying the Republic's sacred laws. This was not just a confrontation between two men. It was a collision between tradition and transformation, birthright and merit, senate and army. Marius and Sulla's rivalry represents the ultimate paradox of the Republic. The system depended on rules, honor, and hierarchy to survive, yet it was also dependent on men like Marius and Sulla, who operated outside those rules to save Rome, and in doing so, they exposed its fragility. Sulla's march was more than a tactical maneuver. It was a statement. The Republic could be bent, coerced, or threatened into obedience by power. And Marius, for all his skill and popularity, would now have to navigate an enemy who understood both politics and the army, a combination more dangerous than any barbarian force beyond the Alps. The years that followed were marked by revenge, civil war, and manipulation. Marius's life became a constant balancing act. He could not lose the army, could not lose the people, and could not entirely defy the Senate without risking annihilation. Every victory was political, every battle was strategic, and every decision carried life or death consequences. Through this rivalry, Rome learned a painful truth: the Republic's stability was no longer guaranteed. A general with an army loyal to him personally could challenge the Senate, change laws, and bend the political system to his will. And Marius, whether he realized it or not, had paved the way. By the time of his later consulships, the line between hero and dictator was blurred. Marius's legacy was dual. He had saved Rome from external annihilation, but in doing so, he had also taught Rome's generals a dangerous lesson: armies could be used to enforce political will. Sulla, patient and calculating, would one day exploit that lesson fully. But Marius had planted the seeds. The Republic, as it had existed for centuries, was forever changed. And yet, despite all the betrayal, the scheming, and the hatred, Marius endured. He continued to serve, to fight, to win, knowing full well that his enemies were now closer than any barbarian beyond the borders. His rivalry with Sulla wasn't just personal. It symbolized the transformation of Rome itself, a city that no longer could rely solely on tradition, but required ambition, cunning, and sometimes ruthless determination to survive. Marius's story here is essential, because it shows the cost of greatness. To change Rome, to save it, to innovate and win, one must inevitably make enemies, and the more you succeed, the more personal that enmity becomes. By the end of this period, Marius had proven one terrifying truth: power belongs to those who can seize it, maintain it, and survive those who seek to take it away. Rome was changed forever, whether its citizens realized it at the time or not, and the architect of that transformation was a man few would have expected: Gaius Marius, the novus homo, the outsider, the man who had risen from a modest town to command the loyalty of Rome's armies. The changes Marius brought were profound. They weren't just temporary fixes for military crises. They reshaped the very foundation of Rome's power structure. The legions he trained, the veterans he empowered, and the reforms he implemented would echo through centuries, setting a precedent that future generals, including Sulla, Pompey, and Julius Caesar, would exploit. Before Marius, Rome's army was a reflection of the Republic itself: hierarchical, tradition-bound, and dependent on wealth. Only citizens who owned land could serve. Soldiers were temporary, loyal to the state rather than any individual commander. When campaigns ended, men returned home, leaving behind a gap in military consistency and professionalism. Marius shattered all of that. He opened the legions to the landless poor, the proletarii men who had no property, no social standing, and until then no voice in the Republic. By offering pay, equipment and land upon discharge, he created a professional army whose loyalty was no longer abstract. Soldiers swore allegiance to their commander, not the Senate, and in doing so, Marius transformed Rome's military into a personalized instrument of power, far more efficient than its predecessors, but far more politically dangerous. This loyalty shift was subtle but revolutionary. Soldiers who depended on their commander for survival became his political allies. Marius's men were not just fighters, they were voters, influencers and enforcers. The army became a political force capable of shaping legislation, swaying elections, and eventually marching on the city itself. The seeds of civil war had been sown, unintentionally but undeniably, by Marius's reforms. The organizational innovations he introduced were equally transformative. He standardized equipment, ensuring that every soldier was uniformly armed. This eliminated the disparities caused by wealth, creating cohesion on the battlefield. Soldiers became interchangeable parts of a disciplined, mobile, and highly trained unit. They drilled endlessly, learned complex maneuvers, and developed endurance that left previous generations' armies looking amateur in comparison. He emphasized rigorous physical training, cohesion between cohorts, and tactical flexibility. No longer would Roman legions crumble under the pressure of unexpected enemy tactics. Marius's reforms ensured they adapted, endured, and dominated. But this professionalization came at a cost. Soldiers no longer fought as citizens with a stake in Rome's collective well-being. They fought as men whose livelihood, honor, and future were tied to one man's vision, Gaius Marius. The implications were enormous. By centralizing military loyalty, Marius inadvertently gave rise to personal armies, a phenomenon that would destabilize the Republic in the following decades. This shift redefined power dynamics. Rome's greatest generals could now challenge, intimidate, or even overthrow the Senate if they chose. The Republic's stability, once safeguarded by centuries of tradition, became fragile. Marius's reforms also had profound social consequences. By recruiting the landless, he gave Rome's marginalized citizens a voice and a purpose. Veterans returned home with land, pay, and respect, slowly elevating their families and altering local power dynamics. Previously disenfranchised citizens now had leverage, visibility, and influence. Rome's social fabric was being rewoven, often in ways the elite found threatening. The old order of wealth-based privilege no longer guaranteed authority. Merit, courage, and loyalty to the general became equally valuable, sometimes more valuable than aristocratic lineage. The strategic impact of Marius's changes was immediately visible. During the Cimbrian War, his restructured legions crushed enemies who had previously annihilated Roman armies. The victories were decisive, almost surgical, demonstrating the power of a professional, disciplined, and loyal military force. Marius's legions could march farther, fight longer, and endure hardship that would have destroyed earlier cohorts. Success reinforced the public perception that Marius's methods were superior, further consolidating his influence over Rome's people and its soldiers. Yet the political consequences were just as dramatic. The army's personal loyalty to commanders like Marius meant that Rome's political arena was now intertwined with military force. Command of legions became a tool for political leverage. Civil wars, once unimaginable, were now a matter of timing and strategy. Future conflicts between Marius and Sulla, and later between Caesar and Pompey, were inevitable extensions of the precedent he set. Marius's legacy was not just military efficiency, it was the politicization of the army, a transformation that would define the fall of the Republic. Marius's impact was also psychological. For centuries, Romans had understood hierarchy, pedigree, and social status as ultimate sources of authority. Marius subverted that notion, proving that competence, charisma, and military success could override birthright. This challenged the deeply ingrained values of the elite, creating tension between traditional authority and merit-based power. His rise demonstrated that Rome could be saved and dominated by men outside the aristocracy. It was liberating for some, terrifying for others, and deeply destabilizing for the political order. Despite the long-term consequences, Marius's contemporaries could not deny his immediate effectiveness. Rome survived wars that would have otherwise destroyed it. Legions became efficient instruments of power, capable of both defense and strategic projection. The people gained confidence in leadership that delivered results rather than rhetoric, and Rome, temporarily, was safe. But the transformation carried a shadow. By centering loyalty on individual commanders, Marius had inadvertently set the stage for the civil wars of the late Republic. Generals like Sulla, Pompey, and Caesar would later use armies personally loyal to them to defy the Senate, seize control of Rome, and rewrite laws according to their own agendas. Marius had created the blueprint, intentionally or not, for the Republic's eventual collapse. His genius lay not just in battlefield victories, but in structural innovation that made military and political upheaval possible. Historians often debate whether Marius foresaw these consequences. Did he understand that his reforms would empower future tyrants, or was his vision purely tactical, aimed at saving Rome in his own lifetime? Evidence suggests Marius was focused on survival and effectiveness. He was a man of action, not ideology. Yet in seeking to strengthen the army, he unwittingly changed the balance of power forever. His legacy also influenced Roman culture and military philosophy. The idea that soldiers were a professional class, trained, disciplined, and rewarded, became the standard. Rome would never return to citizen soldiers alone. The concept of loyalty tied to personal commanders became normalized. Even as the Republic faltered, Marius's innovations endured, leaving a permanent imprint on Roman society and its approach to war. In essence, Marius's reforms represent a paradox. He saved Rome from external enemies while simultaneously sowing the seeds of internal conflict. He empowered the marginalized, professionalized the military, and demonstrated that competence could rival birthright. But he also created a system where personal loyalty could override institutional authority, setting Rome on a path toward civil war and the rise of autocratic generals. Gaius Marius's story is a lesson in power, innovation, and unintended consequences. His reforms were brilliant, effective, and transformative, but they also carried a hidden danger. Rome survived in the short term because of Marius. Rome's republic would eventually crumble in part because of him, and that is the essence of his legacy: a hero to the people, a threat to tradition, a genius who reshaped the military forever, and a man whose innovations would echo through history long after he was gone. By the time Gaius Marius reached the later years of his life, he had become a living legend in Rome. Soldiers adored him, the people revered him, and his victories were still spoken of in forums and marketplaces alike. Yet beneath the surface of glory, his life was riddled with danger, betrayal, and personal tragedy, a stark reminder that even the most celebrated heroes cannot escape the shadows of politics. Marius's repeated consulships, unprecedented in Roman history, reflected both necessity and fear. Rome was desperate. External threats persisted, and internal politics remained volatile. The Germanic tribes had been defeated, but new crises, including rebellions in Africa and unrest within Rome's Italian allies, required a leader with proven military skill. Marius, with his loyal legions and tactical genius, remained indispensable. Yet the Senate and patrician class viewed him with suspicion and resentment. Each victory deepened the envy of men who believed Rome's institutions should reign supreme, not the ambition of one man. Even as triumphs accumulated, Marius's personal life was fraught with sorrow. Unlike other Romans who inherited wealth and influence, Marius came from humble origins. His rise was earned through skill and courage, not inheritance. That meant he had fewer allies in the aristocracy to shield him from slander, sabotage, or outright threats. Political rivals used every opportunity to undermine him, spreading rumors, questioning his motives, and framing his actions as dangerous innovations that threatened the Republic. This constant tension created a kind of silent warfare, one fought in words, alliances, and influence, rather than on the battlefield. The most dangerous of these conflicts was with Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a man whose ambition and ruthlessness would define much of Rome's later history. The seeds of rivalry had been planted during their early campaigns, but as Marius aged, Sulla's hunger for power intensified. Unlike Marius, Sulla had the advantage of patrician heritage. He moved skillfully within the Senate, leveraging connections and manipulating public perception. Marius, despite his popularity with the masses and the army, had to navigate a web of political intrigue that threatened to undo everything he had achieved. Every move required calculation, patience, and occasionally compromise. One of the most striking aspects of Marius's later years was his resilience under personal loss. While he had secured Rome from foreign threats, the internal battles exacted a heavy toll. Friends became enemies, allies betrayed him, and the loyalty of the Senate was impossible to guarantee. He witnessed the Republic's internal divisions deepen, and he saw the fragility of the system he had fought so hard to protect. Yet through it all, Marius continued to serve. He did not retreat into comfort or retirement. He remained at the center of political and military life, understanding that Rome's survival often depended on his presence. Marius's repeated consulships, though legally unprecedented, were justified in the eyes of the people. Each time he assumed office, it was framed as necessary for Rome's stability. Yet these same acts further inflamed his enemies. To the Senate, he had overstepped bounds, breaking centuries of tradition and threatening the very concept of republican governance. They whispered of ambition, unbecoming a Roman, of power concentrated dangerously in the hands of one man, and of the precedent being set for future generals to challenge the Republic itself. Marius's victories, while celebrated by the populace, were a source of dread for those who feared what such unprecedented authority could lead to. The later years of Marius's life were also marked by personal and familial tragedies. Unlike the battlefield, politics offered no clear victories. Friends could not be relied upon. Alliances shifted with alarming speed. He saw veterans, once loyal and disciplined, caught between obligations to the state, their families, and their commander. He endured betrayals that were subtle but devastating, political maneuvers that undermined his reforms, questioned his decisions, and threatened his reputation. Each act was a reminder that survival in Rome required more than skill with a sword. It demanded mastery of intrigue, foresight, and often patience beyond human measure. Marius's life in these years demonstrates the paradox of greatness. The closer one rises to the pinnacle of power, the more enemies one accumulates, and the higher the stakes become. For every legion that cheered his name, there was a senator quietly plotting against him. For every public speech that inspired citizens, there was a whispering rival seeking to turn the people's admiration into fear or suspicion. Triumphs in battle offered temporary respite, but the political battlefield was endless, and there were no easy victories. Despite these pressures, Marius remained a man of action. His reforms continued to influence Rome, shaping both military and social landscapes. Veterans benefited from land distributions, soldiers enjoyed structured careers, and the army's efficiency became a model of discipline and loyalty. Marius's methods were studied, copied, and debated by future commanders, leaving a legacy that outlived him. Yet the personal cost was immense. The life of a military and political innovator was not glamorous. It was exhausting, perilous, and often lonely. Toward the end of his career, Marius faced age, illness, and the weariness of endless struggle. Having survived wars, rivalries, and the relentless pressures of leadership, he found himself confronting the inevitability of human limitation. The very qualities that had propelled him to prominence, relentless ambition, extraordinary discipline, and unwavering focus, also isolated him. Friends passed away, Enemies persisted, and the Republic continued to teeter between tradition and transformation. Marius's life became a study in endurance, how to maintain influence and effectiveness in the face of both mortal decline and unrelenting political opposition. Yet even in these final years, Marius's influence was undeniable. His reforms had permanently altered the Roman army, ensuring its professionalism, discipline, and loyalty. His victories had saved the Republic from multiple existential threats, and his example demonstrated the power of merit, skill, and personal charisma to challenge centuries of entrenched hierarchy. Rome had changed, and Marius had changed it. However, the shadow of his rivalry with Sulla loomed ever larger. The tension between personal ambition and republican ideals, which Marius had navigated with skill, would eventually escalate after his death into full-scale civil conflict. In many ways, the later years of Marius's life serve as a bridge between the Rome of citizen soldiers and the Rome of generals wielding armies as personal instruments of power. His triumphs and tragedies foreshadowed the eventual collapse of the Republic and the rise of autocratic rule. The story of Marius's later years is not merely a chronicle of victories and defeats. It is a study in the human cost of greatness. It shows how innovation, courage, and skill can save a nation, yet simultaneously sow the seeds of internal turmoil. It illustrates the fragility of institutions when personal loyalty outweighs civic duty, and it reminds us that the path of reform, while necessary, is often lonely, perilous, and misunderstood by those who cling to tradition. Gaius Marius died in 86 BCE, having reshaped Rome forever. His reforms, triumphs, and even his political missteps became lessons for generations to come. He left behind a professional army, a transformed political landscape, and a legacy of both reverence and caution. In many ways, his life embodies the duality of heroism, the ability to achieve greatness and yet create circumstances that challenge the very system one seeks to protect. Marius's later years, filled with triumphs, tragedies, and ceaseless political intrigue, reveal the complexities of leadership in a republic struggling to evolve. His story reminds us that even the most celebrated victories carry hidden costs, and that true power often comes with dangers that cannot be fought with swords alone. It is a story of endurance, resilience, and the delicate balance between ambition and responsibility, a story that continues to resonate as one of history's most profound lessons. Gaius Marius died in 86 BCE, an old man, still a titan of Rome's memory, yet unable to control the world he had left behind. His death was not marked by fanfare alone, but by tension, fear, and a city teetering on the edge of chaos. Soldiers mourned him, citizens revered him. The Senate, ever cautious, ever suspicious, feared the precedent he had set. And yet in his final breaths, Marius must have known one immutable truth: his life, victories, and reforms had changed Rome forever, and not always for the better. For decades, Marius had been a living symbol of both hope and danger. He had rescued the Republic from annihilation, transformed the army, and empowered the common man. He had turned legions into machines of discipline, loyalty, and devastating power, and in doing so, he had inadvertently created a system in which future generals could challenge the Republic itself, a system in which personal loyalty often outweighed civic law. Marius's death, therefore, was not merely the passing of a man, it was the moment when the Republic was forced to confront the consequences of his genius. The public mourning was immense. Streets were lined with soldiers who had served under him, veterans who owed their lives and livelihoods to his reforms, and citizens who had witnessed firsthand his capacity to save Rome from threats that seemed insurmountable. Marius had not merely won wars, he had saved families, stabilized regions, and given hope to the disenfranchised. His name became synonymous with courage, dedication, and the possibility of rising above one's circumstances. Yet reverence was shadowed by fear. The Senate had long been wary of Marius's power. For patricians, his repeated consulships, army reforms, and popular support represented a warning. Rome's traditional structures were fragile. If one man could bend law, command loyalty, and influence the people so effectively, what stopped the next ambitious general from going further? What stopped Sulla, Pompey, or even a future Caesar from using similar methods to seize total control? In death, Marius became a symbol of both heroism and caution. Among the people, he was a savior. Among the elite, he was a lesson in the dangers of concentrating power outside established hierarchies. The duality of his reputation encapsulates the paradox of reform. One man's solution can be another's threat. One man's heroism can be another's nightmare. Historians immediately began to debate his legacy. Plutarch, writing years later, praised Marius as a brilliant commander, a champion of the people, and a reformer who saved Rome in its darkest hours. But he also highlighted the dangers inherent in his reforms, the precedent set for personal loyalty over republican law, and the political instability that would inevitably follow. Other sources, more sympathetic to the Senate, portrayed Marius as a dangerous upstart, a man who wielded military power like a sword over the Republic's traditions. The truth, as always, was somewhere in between. Marius's death created a vacuum that would soon plunge Rome into civil war. The city had been stabilized by his reforms, yet destabilized by the very structure he left behind. Soldiers loyal to him remained a force to be reckoned with, but without Marius's leadership, rival generals saw opportunity. Sulla, patient and calculating, seized this moment. He returned from campaigns in the east with a hardened army and a personal vendetta. The stage was set for civil strife, a conflict that would dwarf the external wars Marius had fought and rewrite the Republic forever. Ironically, Marius's greatest triumph, professionalizing the army, became one of Rome's greatest dangers after his death. Loyalty that had saved the Republic could now be turned against it. Commanders could wield armies as political weapons, civilians could be coerced through fear, and the old balance between law, tradition, and military power had been irreversibly altered. Marius's legacy was double-edged. He was both Rome's savior and the blueprint for future internal destruction. Even after his death, Marius's influence persisted. Generals studying his campaigns learned more than tactics. They learned strategy and leadership, loyalty, and the mobilization of resources. Soldiers continued to view the army as an instrument of both survival and personal allegiance. Citizens, particularly the poor, saw in Marius a model of ascension based on skill and merit, not birth. And the Senate, haunted by his career, realized that the Republic could no longer function as it once had. Marius's death also sparked political theater. Public funerals were laden with tension. Senators used the event to assert control. Veterans honored him as a protector, and factions within Rome jockeyed for influence. The city itself became a microcosm of the paradox Marius had created. Respect for a man who had saved them, fear of the system he left behind, and uncertainty about the future. To posterity, Marius was remembered as a revolutionary, not merely a military genius, but a man who changed Rome's structures, society, and military. He embodied the potential of individuals to rise above their circumstances and reshape history, and yet he also demonstrated the fragile balance between reform and chaos. His life and death illustrate the principle that extraordinary innovation often carries hidden consequences. Rome learned this lesson painfully. Within a few years of Marius's death, Sulla marched on Rome, igniting the first full-scale civil war in the city's history. Marius's soldiers were loyal. His reforms were in place, but without his presence, the delicate equilibrium he had maintained collapsed. The Republic would never fully recover its old structures. The cycle of personal armies, political vendettas, and civil conflict, set in motion by Marius's genius, continued for decades. Thus, Gaius Marius's posthumous reputation is complex. Among ordinary Romans, he was a hero, a man of courage, skill, and vision. Among the elite, he was a warning, a man whose reforms demonstrated that the Republic's traditions were not immutable. History remembers him both ways, as the savior of Rome from external annihilation, and as the inadvertent architect of the internal instability that would ultimately doom the Republic. Marius's life and death also raise profound questions about leadership. Can one person, no matter how brilliant, safeguard a republic without undermining its foundations? Can reform coexist with tradition, or does change inherently provoke instability? Marius's story is a testament to both the promise and peril of visionary leadership, a reminder that the consequences of greatness often extend far beyond the individual. In the end, Gaius Marius died as he had lived, a man of courage, resilience, and unparalleled ambition. He left Rome stronger militarily, more professional, and temporarily safe, but he also left a city forever changed, its institutions tested, and a republic exposed to the dangers of personal loyalty over civic law. His posthumous reputation, simultaneously celebrated and feared, ensures that his life remains a central chapter in the story of Rome. Marius was not merely a general, he was a revolutionary of Rome's structure. His reforms, his victories, his political maneuvers, and even his enmities shaped the city long after he was gone. And while he would be remembered as a hero, the shadows of his innovations serve as a cautionary tale. The line between saving a republic and destabilizing it can be razor-thin, and history often judges brilliance and danger side by side. When we think of military reforms, we often imagine changes on the battlefield, new weapons, new tactics, new strategies. But Gaius Marius's reforms went far beyond training soldiers to fight more effectively. They transformed Roman society itself, the lives of ordinary citizens, veterans, and the very way people understood loyalty, opportunity, and survival in the Republic. Before Marius, the average Roman citizen's life was tightly bound to property, status, and tradition. The army was a temporary obligation for landowners. If you were poor, you didn't fight. You didn't vote, and you had little voice in the Republic's affairs. Wealth and birth determined your influence, your opportunities, and your destiny. For the landless, survival was a daily struggle, and Rome's military, while glorious, was largely inaccessible to them. Marius shattered that barrier. By opening the legions to the Capita Censi, the poorest citizens, he created a path for social mobility unlike anything Rome had seen. Suddenly the disenfranchised could earn pay, food, equipment, and eventually land. Suddenly skill, courage, and loyalty mattered more than birthright. A man who had nothing could rise, fight, and gain respect, sometimes more respect than the aristocracy who had long dismissed him. The transformation wasn't just economic, it was psychological. For the first time, the proletari, the landless, had a sense of purpose beyond survival. Enlistment became a means of identity, pride, and even empowerment. They were no longer powerless spectators in Rome's destiny. They became active participants, shaping the outcomes of wars, campaigns, and political decisions. Soldiers became citizens in a new sense, integrated into Rome's future through loyalty and service rather than inheritance. The consequences of this shift rippled through society. Veterans who had completed their service were now entitled to land allocations, creating a new class of property-owning citizens from previously marginalized men. Their families benefited, entire neighborhoods shifted in influence, and the social order slowly adjusted to a reality in which merit and military service could rival lineage. The lower classes, once invisible to the state, now held tangible power and had a vested interest in Rome's stability. This empowerment was both liberating and destabilizing. Aristocrats, accustomed to unquestioned authority, viewed these developments with suspicion. Soldiers and veterans, now confident in their role, could exert pressure on politics. They could support generals who provided for them, oppose those who didn't, and act as a social force capable of influencing the Republic's trajectory. The loyalty of the army, once incidental, had become political currency. Marius's reforms also redefined the relationship between the army and the city. Soldiers no longer fought as temporary citizens, they fought as professionals whose lives were entwined with their commander's vision. Loyalty shifted from the abstract concept of the Republic to the tangible figure of the general. This created unprecedented social and political dynamics, Generals became patrons, soldiers became clients, and the boundaries between military and civil life blurred. The economic impact was equally significant. Pay, land grants and equipment distribution injected resources into previously marginalized communities. Veterans became local leaders, often taking up administrative roles or influencing municipal affairs. Military service became a stepping stone to economic stability and even political power. Ordinary citizens who once had no voice found themselves invested in the Republic's survival, a survival that now depended as much on personal allegiance as it did on law or tradition. Yet there was a hidden cost. The dependence of soldiers on their general created an inherent tension between the Republic and those who served it. Personal loyalty could be leveraged, manipulated, or weaponized. Generals who understood this dynamic could sway political outcomes, intimidate opponents, and ultimately challenge the authority of the Senate. Marius may have created opportunity for the common man, but he also created a mechanism for potential unrest, one that future leaders would exploit. The social transformation also altered the perception of heroism and citizenship. Previously, honor was tied to birth, tradition, and lineage. Now it could be earned through service, discipline, and courage. A man from nothing could rise to prominence through military achievement, gaining respect that the old aristocracy might never concede. This democratization of honor, while empowering, challenged centuries of social hierarchy and created friction between the new and the old Rome. Families of soldiers were impacted as well. Enlistment meant a regular income, but it also meant long absences. Fathers, brothers, and sons were away for years at a time, forging bonds in the army that replaced traditional family structures. Communities learned to rely on returning veterans as pillars of stability and leadership. In this way, Marius's reforms reshaped not just the military, but the very fabric of Roman community life. Perhaps most importantly, Marius instilled a sense of identity and purpose in a class of citizens who had previously been invisible. The poor, once marginalized, now carried the weight and pride of defending Rome. Their loyalty, courage, and sacrifices became the foundation of the Republic's military and social strength. This shift, empowering ordinary men while centralizing authority in the hands of a few generals, set a pattern that would define Roman society for generations. Marius's reforms also emphasized discipline, education, and cohesion. Soldiers learned not just to fight, but to operate as a unit, to follow orders, and to uphold the honor of their legions. This sense of collective identity extended to veterans who returned home. Their service became a source of social recognition, a badge of honor, and a tool for influencing their communities. Marius had created a new citizen soldier, a professional who was socially empowered and militarily indispensable. Yet, as with many transformative changes, the effects were double-edged. The empowerment of soldiers and veterans came at the cost of traditional checks and balances. Loyalty to the general could supersede loyalty to the Republic. The same army that defended Rome could, under different circumstances, march on it. Marius's reforms had strengthened Rome against external enemies, but they had also sown the seeds of internal vulnerability. In summary, Marius's impact on Roman society cannot be overstated. He reshaped the army, empowered the marginalized, redefined citizenship, and created new pathways for social mobility. Soldiers, veterans, and ordinary citizens found purpose, recognition, and opportunity through service. Yet the personal loyalty his reforms fostered would also challenge the Republic's stability, setting a precedent for civil wars and the rise of powerful generals. Marius's reforms remind us that true societal transformation is rarely without complexity. Every advantage carries a risk, every empowerment carries a cost, and every innovation carries consequences that can outlast its creator. Gaius Marius did not merely change the Roman army, he changed Rome itself, socially, politically, and culturally, in ways that would reverberate for generations. The year was 113 BCE, and Rome was teetering on the brink of disaster. To the north, the Cimbri and Teutones, massive Germanic tribes were moving south with terrifying momentum. These were not ordinary enemies. They were giants of the north, seasoned warriors who had already annihilated Roman armies sent to confront them. Entire legions had been wiped out, cities terrified, and panic gripped the Republic. Rome's survival, not just its dominance but its very existence, was in question. Enter Gaius Marius, a man whose reforms and leadership would soon become legend. The Senate, desperate and fearful, turned once again to him. They did so reluctantly, aware that repeated consulships for one man were extraordinary and potentially dangerous. Yet Rome had no alternative. The old citizen armies had failed. The Republic needed a professional general with a loyal, disciplined army, and Marius had exactly that. From the very first moment, Marius took command. He transformed fear into precision. He understood his enemy in ways previous commanders had not. The Cimbri were not just soldiers, they were a migration force. Tens of thousands of men, women and children moving across Europe, armed, determined, and growing stronger with each step south. The Teutones were swift, brutal, and accustomed to chaos, the kind of enemies Rome's traditional forces could not easily contain. Marius's genius lay in preparation. He drilled his legions relentlessly, emphasizing discipline, endurance, and cohesion. Every man knew his role. Every cohort moved like a single organism. Marius ensured that soldiers were equipped uniformly, no man underprepared, no man left behind. This was the first real test of his professional army, and every practice, every march, and every maneuver had a purpose. The Battle of Aquae Sextiae, fought in 102 BCE, became the defining moment. Marius positioned his forces with surgical precision. The terrain was carefully chosen, ambush points meticulously calculated. The Cimbri and Teutones, confident in their size and ferocity, advanced only to find themselves funneled into kill zones designed by Rome's greatest tactician. Marius had studied their movements, anticipated their attacks, and turned their strength into vulnerability. The battle itself was a horror for the Cimbri. Marius's disciplined legions struck with timing and coordination that the Germanic tribes had never encountered. Cavalry flanked, infantry pressed, and archers rained volleys that shattered morale. Romans did not merely fight, they executed. Every soldier moved with purpose, every maneuver calculated, every action reinforcing the machine Marius had built. By the day's end, tens of thousands of enemies lay dead, and survivors were enslaved or dispersed. The threat that had once paralyzed Rome was obliterated, but victory at Aquae Sextiae was not the end. The Cimbri still lingered as a potential threat. Rome was not yet entirely safe. Marius anticipated this, understanding that complacency was Rome's enemy. He continued training, preparing, and positioning his legions for the next confrontation. The Battle of Vercellae in 101 BCE would be decisive, and Marius ensured that every aspect of his army was ready for what was to come. At Vercellae, Marius faced the remnants of the Cimbri. The battle was a culmination of strategy, discipline, and sheer resolve. Marius's legions held formation under pressure, absorbed enemy charges without breaking, and executed counterattacks with precision. What had previously been chaotic and terrifying for Rome's citizen soldiers became manageable for Marius's professional army. By the end, the Cimbri were annihilated, their leaders executed, their tribes scattered, and Rome's northern frontier secured. The psychological impact of these victories was enormous. Romans who had lived in terror for years now celebrated with jubilation. Marius was hailed not just as a commander, but as a savior of the Republic. His victories inspired awe, fear, and admiration, solidifying his status as one of Rome's greatest generals. Yet the deeper impact was structural. Rome's military had proven itself capable of defeating enemies that had previously seemed unstoppable. The professional army, trained, loyal, and disciplined, was now the cornerstone of Roman security. Marius's approach to warfare in the Cimbrian War showcased the full power of his reforms. Soldiers fought not because of civic duty, but because of loyalty, training, and pride in their unit. They were equipped, organized, and led with precision. Leadership was centralized in the commander, but the execution was collective, disciplined, and flawless. The success of these battles proved the viability of a professional army and demonstrated that Rome could survive threats that would have crushed it under its old system. However, the Cimbrian War also revealed the political consequences of Marius's power. His unprecedented successes made him immensely popular with soldiers and citizens alike, but the Senate, wary of concentrated military power, began to view him with fear. By winning decisively, Marius had strengthened his position in Rome's political hierarchy, setting the stage for future conflicts with rivals like Sulla. The very loyalty that had saved Rome now posed a subtle but significant challenge to traditional republican authority. Victory over the Cimbri also had long-term cultural implications. For the Roman people, the notion of a general commanding absolute loyalty was normalized. Soldiers' allegiance to their commander, rather than solely to the Republic, became accepted, a dangerous precedent that would later be exploited by ambitious leaders. Marius had saved Rome from annihilation, but in doing so, he had also shown that personal power and military might could override civic structures, planting seeds of civil strife. And yet, Marius's legacy in the Cimbrian War was not just about politics or power. It was also about human ingenuity, leadership, and courage. He turned fear into strategy, inexperience into discipline, and vulnerability into dominance. His victories were a testament to foresight, preparation, and relentless commitment to both his men and Rome. Ordinary citizens saw in him the embodiment of possibility, a man of humble origins who could rise to face the greatest threats and emerge victorious. The Cimbrian War, in many ways, was the final validation of Marius's reforms. Every tactic, every drill, every organizational innovation was tested under extreme conditions. The professional army proved itself not only capable of survival, but of total victory. Marius's legacy as a military innovator was secured, and his model of the disciplined, loyal, and professional soldier became the standard for Rome for decades. Yet, even in triumph, shadows lingered. The power of the general, the personal loyalty of soldiers, and the precedent of repeated consulships foreshadowed the political turmoil that would grip Rome in the coming decades. Victory had saved the Republic from external destruction, but it also exposed the Republic to internal vulnerability. Marius had proven what Rome could accomplish and what it could not resist. The story of the Cimbrian War is therefore more than a tale of battlefield triumph. It is a story of transformation, of an army, a society, and a republic reshaped forever. It is the moment when Rome moved from citizen soldiers to professional legions, from tradition-bound politics to power influenced by military loyalty, and from a fragile republic to a society capable of both great victories and catastrophic internal conflict. Marius's genius lay not only in crushing Rome's greatest threat, but in demonstrating the full potential and danger of the systems he created. His victories were decisive, his reforms proven, and his influence absolute. The Cimbrian War was Rome's darkest hour, turned into its most illuminating triumph, a testament to the vision, discipline, and enduring legacy of Gaius Marius. After the triumphs of Gaius Marius, Rome seemed invincible. Its armies had crushed the Cimbri and Teutones. Its citizens were inspired. Yet beneath the celebrations, the Republic simmered with tension. Political rivalries had deepened, alliances were fragile, and ambition festered in ways that would soon erupt into chaos. At the center of this storm stood Lucius Cornelius Sulla, a man whose rise would challenge everything Marius had built and thrust Rome into its first full-scale civil war. Sulla was different from Marius. Where Marius rose from humble beginnings, Sulla was patrician, born into a family of aristocratic privilege. He had wealth, connections, and access to political corridors most could only dream of. But Sulla possessed something else, a relentless ambition and an unflinching belief in his destiny. From the start, he understood that Rome's power lay not just in armies but in controlling how power itself flowed. The rivalry between Marius and Sulla began subtly, almost imperceptibly. Both men had served Rome with distinction, both had led armies to victory, and both had legions loyal to them personally, yet their paths diverged sharply. Marius's popularity rested on his connection to the people and the soldiers who had benefited from his reforms. Sulla's influence stemmed from wealth, aristocratic heritage, and strategic cunning. This divergence would make conflict inevitable. The tension escalated during campaigns in the east. Sulla had been appointed to command against King Mithridates of Pontus, a dangerous and ambitious ruler who threatened Rome's provinces. Yet Marius, exploiting his popularity in Rome, maneuvered politically to have the command transferred to himself. This act was not merely bureaucratic, it was a direct challenge, a public humiliation aimed at undermining Sulla's authority. The stage was set for confrontation. Sulla's response was unprecedented. No Roman general had ever marched on the city itself with his army. But Sulla understood the stakes. His command, his honor, and his future were all on the line. In 88 BCE, he did the unthinkable. He led his legions into Rome. The city, once untouchable to Roman armies, became a battlefield. Streets that had echoed with political debate now trembled under the boots of professional soldiers, loyal not to the Senate, not to tradition, but to their general. The psychological impact of Sulla's march was immense. Romans who had celebrated Marius's victories now faced the terrifying reality that loyalty to a commander could override civic law. Sulla's legions entered Rome without hesitation, occupying key positions, intimidating magistrates, and asserting control. Marius, forced to flee, became a symbol of how even the greatest hero could be challenged when personal armies replaced citizen loyalty. Civil war erupted. Rome fractured along lines defined not by ideology but by allegiance. Soldiers who had once fought under Marius were torn between loyalty to him and recognition of Sulla's growing power. Political elites maneuvered desperately, seeking survival in a city where the ultimate authority rested on the battlefield rather than in the Senate. The Republic itself became a prize in a conflict driven by personal rivalry. Sulla's genius was not only military but strategic. He understood that winning Rome required more than force. It required fear, symbolism, and timing. Executions, exiles, and public displays of power were carefully orchestrated to establish dominance. Every victory, every act of intimidation, reinforced the idea that military might now dictated political legitimacy. Marius, once the savior of Rome, now faced the harsh reality of a republic in which the rules had changed. Yet Marius was not powerless. Despite his age and previous successes, he leveraged his popularity, rallied supporters, and attempted to reclaim authority. The city became a chessboard of intrigue, ambushes, and counter-strategies. Political speeches, manipulations, and public ceremonies were weapons as potent as swords. Rome was in chaos, caught between two titans whose legacies and ambitions would redefine its future. The Civil War exposed fundamental vulnerabilities in the Republic's structure. Loyalty to commanders, once an advantage against external threats, had become a tool for personal ambition. The mechanisms Marius had put in place to save Rome, a professional, loyal army, could now be exploited for internal domination. The very reforms that preserved the Republic's survival against the Cimbri now threatened its stability from within. Families, communities, and ordinary citizens were caught in the crossfire. Soldiers' families were displaced, property was seized, and neighborhoods became staging grounds for political and military operations. Rome's social fabric was torn, showing that civil war is as much about psychological terror as it is about open conflict. Citizens realized the stark truth. Allegiance had shifted, and survival depended on navigating a world where generals wielded armies as political instruments. The rivalry between Marius and Sulla had long-term consequences. Even after temporary reconciliations and truces, the precedent was set. Generals could challenge political norms with force. Personal loyalty could outweigh civic duty. Ambition could justify the occupation of Rome itself. Civil war was no longer unthinkable. It had become a reality, and future leaders would not hesitate to follow the same path. Marius's death in 86 BCE did little to stabilize the Republic. Sulla continued to consolidate power, using the professional army as his instrument of authority. The lessons of loyalty, discipline, and personal devotion to a commander that Marius had taught were now tools for domination. Rome had been saved from external annihilation, but the seeds of internal collapse were germinating, nurtured by the very innovations that had ensured its survival. The rise of Sulla illustrates a critical paradox in history. Reforms that empower and save can also destabilize. Marius had given Rome professional soldiers, a disciplined army, and loyal followers. Sulla demonstrated that the same tools could be repurposed for civil conquest. The Republic was no longer merely a system of laws and traditions. It was now a stage for personal ambition, where military might dictated political legitimacy. Yet in the midst of war and chaos, lessons emerged. Romans saw firsthand the power of leadership, loyalty, and strategy. Citizens, soldiers, and senators learned that survival depended not just on courage, but on perception, alliances, and timing. Marius's vision of a professional army had proved its worth in saving Rome from annihilation. Sulla's exploitation of that same army revealed the dangers inherent in concentrated military power. The civil war between Marius and Sulla set the tone for decades of Roman politics. It established a pattern in which generals could challenge traditional authority, armies could influence governance, and personal ambition could reshape the course of history. Rome would never return to the simplicity of citizen soldiers defending their city. The seeds of empire, dictatorship, and civil strife were already planted, and the Republic's fate had been irrevocably altered. In the end, the rivalry between Marius and Sulla is more than a tale of two men. It is a story about the delicate balance between reform and stability, ambition and duty, loyalty and law. It shows how innovations intended to save a state can be repurposed to challenge it, and how personal power can become both a shield and a weapon. The rise of Sulla, the civil wars, and the shifting loyalties of Rome's legions were a direct consequence of Marius's reforms. History remembers them both, Marius as the savior who professionalized the army, Sulla as the ambitious general who wielded it for personal power. Together, their stories illustrate a profound truth about leadership, society, and the fragility of even the greatest republics. Gaius Marius died in 86 BCE, but his influence did not die with him. In fact, his shadow stretched far longer than most generals ever dreamed. The man who had saved Rome from the Cimbri and Teutones had done more than win battles. He had reshaped Rome itself, its army, its politics, and even its very culture. And like all great transformations, the consequences were both inspiring and terrifying. When we think of Marius, it is easy to remember the victories, the dramatic battles, the applause of the Roman people. But the true legacy is quieter, deeper. It is in the soldiers who could fight like a single organism, moving with precision and discipline that the Republic had never known. It is in the loyalty of the legions, men willing to follow their commander anywhere across rivers, mountains, and even into the heart of their own city. It is in the way Rome began to see the professional soldier as a permanent, indispensable part of society. Before Marius, armies had been temporary. Citizens left their farms, fought, and returned. Duty ended when the campaign ended. After Marius, service became a career, a path to identity, survival, and sometimes power. This shift changed everything. Soldiers no longer depended solely on the Republic. They depended on their general, and loyalty that once strengthened the state could now be directed toward personal ambition. The brilliance of Marius was that he saved Rome. The danger of Marius was that he created a model for civil war. The soldiers he trained would remain loyal to him, and later other generals would replicate that same system. Sulla, Pompey, Caesar, all understood the lesson. The power of a personal army was irresistible, and Rome would never be the same. Marius also democratized military opportunity. For the first time, men without property, men born into poverty, could enlist and they could rise. Pay, equipment, land, recognition, all of it was possible through service. A man could now rewrite his destiny with a sword in hand. This was revolutionary. Rome's rigid social hierarchy was shaken. The aristocracy could no longer claim that only birth determined value. Merit mattered, courage mattered, loyalty mattered. The people saw that change, and it inspired hope and fear, because where there is empowerment, there is also upheaval. Marius's reforms gave ordinary Romans a voice, a stake in their republic, a way to participate beyond the vote. But it also created a system where armies could wield political influence. His victories in the Cimbrian War proved that professional, loyal soldiers could decide the fate of nations, and Sulla would soon demonstrate that loyalty could be turned against Rome itself. Marius's shadow did not stop at the army. Politically, he had challenged centuries of tradition, repeated consulships, popularity with the masses, and command of the legions allowed him to bend republican norms to save the state. This precedent did not vanish with his death. Future leaders would remember personal influence backed by soldiers could override Senate authority, and when Rome faced civil war, they would act. Marius's greatest gift to Rome, ironically, was also his greatest curse. He showed that power could be centralized, militarized, and wielded personally, a lesson that would echo through the rise of dictators and emperors. But there was also a human legacy. The soldiers who fought under Marius carried his lessons into every corner of the Republic. Discipline, loyalty, coordination, the ability to overcome fear. They became teachers, veterans, mentors to the next generation of legions. The families of soldiers benefited too. Land grants and pensions allowed men to provide for their children. Communities were strengthened by the presence of veterans who had experienced the discipline, courage, and hardship of the army. And yet, there was cost. Many veterans became politically active, leveraging loyalty and influence to sway elections, manipulate votes, or intimidate rivals. The very success of Marius's reforms destabilized Rome's social and political order in ways the Republic had never anticipated. Civil wars, purges, and assassinations became increasingly common, a pattern that would culminate in the rise of the Roman Empire. Even historians struggle with Marius's legacy. Was he a hero, a visionary, or a dangerous innovator whose reforms sowed the seeds of the Republic's collapse? The answer is all of the above. Marius saved Rome from destruction. He empowered the disenfranchised. He professionalized the army and proved that discipline, loyalty, and strategy could triumph over sheer numbers. But he also created a template for military loyalty to personal power, a system that future generals would exploit for their own ambition. Every triumph carried consequences, every reform carried risk. And yet, Marius's story is ultimately a story of courage, resilience, and audacity. He rose from obscurity to save the Republic. He faced enemies far greater than himself. He reshaped institutions, inspired men, and changed history. Even in death, his name carried weight. Soldiers invoked it, politicians feared it, and Rome, forever altered, bore the mark of his genius and his audacity. To this day, Marius reminds us that history is rarely simple. Heroes can create monsters. Reforms can be both salvation and destruction, and the line between brilliance and danger is often razor-thin. Marius's legacy is a mirror. It reflects the potential of vision, discipline, and leadership, but also the consequences of loyalty misplaced, power concentrated, and ambition unchecked. When we study Rome, we remember the victories, the battles, the reforms, but we must also remember the ripples, the civil wars, the rise of Sulla, and the eventual collapse of the Republic. Marius shaped not just an army, but a civilization, and in that shaping, he taught Rome and the world that great power comes with great responsibility, and that history often demands both courage and caution. The story of Gaius Marius is, in essence, a story of humanity, ambition, loyalty, innovation, risk, triumph, consequence. His life and reforms are a reminder that individuals can alter the course of history, but the structures they create may outlast them, for better or worse. Marius did not merely fight enemies, he fought tradition, limitation, and the very boundaries of what Rome thought was possible. And in doing so, he left a legacy that would define the Republic and the empire that followed for centuries. When we look back at Rome, we often see marble temples, triumphal arches, and legions marching in perfect formation. We remember the wars, the emperors, and the tales of glory, but some stories are quieter. They don't echo through statues or coins. They are written in the lives shaped, the institutions transformed, and the shadows of the Republic itself. Gaius Marius's story is one of those quiet, seismic narratives. He was not born into privilege. He was not handed power. Yet he rose against all odds to save a republic teetering on the brink of annihilation. Imagine Rome in the 2nd century BCE, terrified, weakened, paralyzed by threats both foreign and internal. Entire armies had been destroyed. Cities feared invasion. Families grieved sons lost to barbarian forces. And then a man from a small town, Arpinum, stepped forward. He redefined what it meant to be a Roman soldier, turning ordinary men into a professional, disciplined, and loyal army. He reformed the military, ensuring that the Republic could withstand threats the old citizen armies could not. He gave land, pay, and purpose to the poor, empowering a class of citizens who had been invisible for generations. And yet, he did more than that. He changed Rome's very political and social fabric. Loyalty shifted from the Republic to its generals. Ambition became a tool that could challenge tradition. Professional armies became instruments of personal power. These were consequences Marius may never have anticipated, but they were inevitable, because when you change the rules of society, even for noble reasons, you invite both progress and danger. Marius's victories in the Cimbrian War saved Rome from external destruction. His reforms saved the Republic from internal decay caused by outdated military systems. And yet, these very reforms would later contribute to civil wars, rivalries, and the eventual collapse of the republican system. The rise of Sulla, the civil strife, and the shift toward empire were, in many ways, part of Marius's legacy. This is the paradox of greatness. The very innovations that save a civilization can also sow the seeds of its challenges. But we cannot reduce Marius's story to just political consequence. It is a human story, a story of ambition, courage, sacrifice, and vision, of a man who walked into battles that others fled, who commanded respect through discipline, leadership, and fearlessness, who empowered those who had been overlooked, giving them purpose, identity, and opportunity, and who, despite envy, hatred, and political sabotage, rose to meet Rome's greatest crises.
Gaius Marius reminds us that history is shaped by individuals. Not just by kings, senators, or emperors, but by those willing to challenge convention, endure criticism, and fight for survival against overwhelming odds. Yet his life also teaches caution.
Power is intoxicating, loyalty is fragile. Reforms ripple through time, often beyond the control of their creator. Marius's professional army, a miracle in its day, became both a shield for Rome and a tool for ambition. The Republic was saved but transformed forever. Every general who followed, from Sulla to Julius Caesar, built upon the system Marius had created. Every civil war that shook Rome carried echoes of his reforms. Every citizen who served in the legions, every veteran who claimed land, every ordinary man empowered by service owed a debt to him. Yet Rome, in its memory, often overlooked him. Marius was celebrated in the moment, but soon faded into history compared to the emperors who followed. And yet, without him, the empire as we know it might never have existed. He bridged the gap between chaos and order, between citizen soldiers and professional legions, between a fragile republic and the powerful, disciplined Rome that would dominate the Mediterranean for centuries. When we study Rome today, the monuments cannot tell us everything. The scrolls, the coins, the inscriptions, they speak of victories, triumphs, and glory. But the transformation of society, the empowerment of ordinary men, the shift of loyalty from civic duty to leadership, these are the real stories. And at the center of that transformation stands Gaius Marius. He reminds us that true leadership is not about birth, wealth, or privilege. It is about vision, courage, and the willingness to act when the world is falling apart. It is about creating systems that endure, even when those systems carry unintended consequences. Marius's life also reminds us of sacrifice. He endured political hatred, personal envy, and the resentment of elites who feared his rise. He fought enemies abroad while navigating treacherous allies at home. He bore the weight of Rome's survival on his shoulders, knowing that failure could mean annihilation. And yet he persisted. For every victory, there was strategy. For every reform, there was foresight. For every triumph, there was risk. The story of Gaius Marius is a story of balance, between courage and caution, between innovation and tradition, between public duty and personal ambition. It is a story of a man who reshaped his world for better and for worse, and it is a story that resonates even today, because in every society, every institution, every movement, there are Marius-like figures, those who challenge tradition to save the system, those whose reforms carry both promise and peril, those whose courage is measured not by applause but by endurance under scrutiny, adversity, and risk. When we remember Gaius Marius, we do not just remember a general, we remember a visionary, a reformer, a man who proved that even the most fragile republic can be saved through courage, discipline, and leadership, while also showing that every transformation carries consequences beyond its creator's control. And perhaps the most important lesson of all, history is not just about the victories we see or the battles won. It is about the lives reshaped, the systems transformed, and the legacies left behind, intended or not. Gaius Marius's legacy is permanent because it is complex. It is celebrated and feared. It is inspiring and cautionary. It is a reminder that the power of one individual can change the fate of a civilization. And it is a story we must never forget. So when you think of Rome, do not only think of emperors, senators, or the grandeur of conquest. Think of the men who changed the republic from within. Think of the general who trained soldiers, redefined loyalty, and transformed a society, Gaius Marius, the man from Arpinum who rose from nothing, fought impossible wars, challenged tradition, and left a mark that would shape the Roman Empire for centuries. Because in the end, history remembers not just those who ruled, but those who dared to remake the world. Marius dared, Rome survived, and the world changed forever.